Let's now check out the Wavetable editor. Clicking on this pencil tool here in Wavetable mode will open up the Wavetable editor. In this bottom section of the Wavetable editor, we're seeing the graphical user interface to edit the shapes. So currently in this default shapes, we have 9 of these different frames, and I can select any one of these frames and I can go ahead and edit the shape. Now, how do I edit the shape? Well, we get to choose from these different brushes. And another important thing to keep in mind is the grid here. So you can see in the background, I have a grid. So right now, if I select this shape, when I click, I'm adding in that particular shape, but based on this grid over here. If I click and drag, it's still following that grid. If I change the grid, let's say I make this larger. So now you can see, again, the line is following that grid. So that's the vertical grid and that's the horizontal grid. You can hold down Shift and click and drag one of them to set them to the same value and adjust them simultaneously. The maximum it goes up to is 64 for both. So you can get really fine shape like this. And on the other extreme, you can actually bring it all the way down to 0. When the grid is set to 0, we're essentially in freehand mode. So I can just draw whatever shape I want. Let's have a quick listen to this shape. Now, one general thing to keep in mind with drawing waveforms is if you have nice curves on the shape, you tend to have less upper harmonics. And if you have sharp edges like this, you'll have more. So let's say I select this shape here. This is our sine wave shape. I'll set the grid back to something like 8 by 8. I should have held down Shift there. So holding down Shift, I'll set this to 8. And now when I click and drag, I'm creating that sine wave shape, but following the grid. All right, so now this is not going to be very pure sounding because we have sharp edges. So it's a combination of some sharp edges and some nice smooth curves. So you can hear some upper harmonics, but you also hear that nice clean low end with the cleaner lower harmonics. All right, let's try this one, this ramp up shape. So click and drag upwards. You can kind of create a sawtooth-like shape with this. We're almost a sawtooth, except this section here is different. We have a ramp down. So I can kind of create a triangle shape like this. Can be a little tricky. You just have to click and drag in the correct way. So let's try some of these other shapes here. These two are interesting. So this one will give us that S curve. So not quite a sine wave shape. Let's make that grid a little bit larger. Let's do 2 by 2. So now when I click, I get this nice sine wave-like shape. Interestingly, it sounds like a sawtooth. It's also just in the positive. We don't have anything in the negative. Let's do 4 by 4. So I'll increase this to 4 by 4. Now when I click and drag. Yeah, it's kind of like a curvy sawtooth. It's an interesting sound. The other way around. A little bit more low end. We have this half sine option. That's kind of interesting. The upside down version of that. A lot more mellow now, the entire sound. Now these two will edit existing shapes. So let me crank that back up to a high value. Maybe pick one of these shapes and create a lot of sharp edges. That's what I have right now. Now with this, I can connect certain lines. Now it's already, maybe I should have selected this one. Let's try this one. Yeah, there we go. All right, so now with this, when I click, you notice those curves, they get straightened out. So we just have a clean diagonal line to connect from one edge to the other. This one does a similar thing, but it creates a smooth shape. So you can see there's a little S curve there. We already have an S curve. So now maybe if I go back to this shape, so let's say that's a bit too sharp, bit too narrow pulse-like sound. So I can use this to kind of smoothen it out. If I just click and drag, the entire thing can be smoothened out like that. Almost like applying a filter. This one's interesting. So this one also affects existing shapes. This will just select and this will just let you select and drag within that grid the shape up or down. So again, if I make that grid a bit larger, I can select bigger chunks and move it up or down. And this one's interesting. This last one here is to add noise. So when I click, I've added this, again following the grid, I've added some noise there, a little bit of noise here. A bit of noise there. Now when you click, you'll get this pretty aggressive noise, but you can also click and drag downwards to tone it down. Right, so it can be subtle. And of course, you can also just click and drag across, and now we have this extreme, very noisy shape. And then click and drag downwards to tone it down a bit. It's nice that you can audition this in real time. So as I'm adjusting things, you're hearing the final result. Awesome. All right, then there's mirror editing. This one's kind of fun. So let's go back to maybe this shape here. So I'm going to make an edit here. Keep an eye on this side of this editor. So you notice how we have mirrored editing going on. So whatever change I'm creating over here is affected over here. All right, so you can create like really interesting mirrored shapes. All right, so those are all the different brush modes. Now, before we move on, I want to talk about these nudge options for time and amp. So if I click this button here, notice how the entire shape gets nudged to the left. So think of it like phase shifting, right? So either nudge the entire shape left or right. So if you want things to align up to a zero crossing, you may want to be able to do something like this. Now, this may not always work because depending on your shape, so if it doesn't align up to the grid, the nudge is not going to work. So if I set this to 0, now the nudge does not work at all. You might think that, okay, maybe then I can freely move it, but it just doesn't do that. There are other options for adjusting phase, but this would not work for that. So this is just to nudge things based on the grid. We also have amp nudging. So let's say I want the shape to just move up. So move up, and eventually when it clips, it comes back down here. So that's kind of interesting, right? So you can keep going up, and it's a great way to come up with new shapes. And nothing really clips. It's all basically reflected back down into itself. And same thing for coming back down. So it goes back the other way. Looks kind of nice as I'm clicking that again and again. All right, let's now talk more about some of the options we have down here. So we have 9 frames in this wavetable, and I was editing the first one. If I hit the plus button, I can duplicate what I've selected. So I have a second one, and then I can make some further changes to kind of make a variation on that particular frame. This plus button does the same thing, so I've duplicated that. There's a minus button here that will remove a frame. Right, so remove both of those frames. And we can click and drag here to just kind of audition all the different frames. Further options over here, we can copy this frame and then paste it somewhere. So let's say I want to replace this one. I don't like this. So I'll select paste, and now it's pasted over here. We have remove options. So clicking over here, we have an entire drop-down list here. So in it all, we just initialize the entire wavetable just for this oscillator. Remove will remove the current, they're calling it index, but it's basically the frame. So that's gone now. Let me undo that. Click over here. Let's see, remove multi-selection. So let's say I don't want any of these square pulse shapes. So I was holding down Shift, click on the first one, and then clicked on the last one in the list. So these contiguous frames, I want to get rid of them. So remove multi-selection, we'll get rid of those. All right, let's undo that as well. What else do we have? Remove beginning to selection. So let's say I put my cursor here, or in other words, select frame 5. It'll remove all the frames up to that point and keep everything else. Let's undo that as well. Other option is the other way around. So remove selected to end. So these frames on the right are all gone. Undid that. Remove all except selected. So I've only selected frame number 9. So when I select this, everything's gone except that one frame. Undo that as well. Lastly, we have these interesting options here, reduce to. So keep half. So basically we can say, all right, I don't need so many frames. I just need half of them. So I'll select keep half. And now we have half of them. So there were very few to begin with. So that could be helpful in certain situations. You want to reduce the number of frames. You can actually bring it down to 1/64th of your existing wavetable. So if I select that, essentially I just have one frame left. All right, the number will vary depending on how many frames you have. So those are all the different ways to remove frames in your wavetable. There's also sorting options here. This also gets a little too much, but I have 9 frames. So let's say I had 256 frames, and I want to sort them by peak, by average spectrum, peak amount, number width spectrum, highest width spectrum, fundamental amount. This is easy to understand, sort randomize. So if I select this, it's just kind of randomly sorting them, and you can keep doing that. The last one is also helpful. You can just reverse the order. So instead of this order, I want it to be backwards. So you can select that. And then the rest of them, honestly, you can play around with this. But I found the most helpful to be this one, highest width spectrum. So in other words, we start with the cleanest sound. Well, not cleanest sound, but the sound with the least amount of harmonics. And it gradually gets more and more harmonically rich, right? And that kind of makes sense. So think of it like some kind of fake filter type effect. All right, so those are all the different options we have over here. All right, next I want to talk about these processing options over here. So under the single drop-down menu, we can process just the currently selected frame in our wavetable, or we can process all of them together. All right, so let's start with the single option. First one is normalize. So if you have a wavetable or a specific frame that's not completely normalized in terms of loudness, we can create that. Now I'm trying to change this because we are not going to hear a change or see a change otherwise. So what would be the best way to kind of, maybe if I pull this down a bit, pull this back up, pull that down. Yeah, so that now looks like there's room for it to become louder. Maybe this needs to go up. Oh yeah, these two are connected. I'll just redraw that shape. All right. Okay, so we have something, we have a little bit of headroom. So now I can select normalize and it's louder, right? It's a lot of work to explain one simple thing. Remove DC offset. So if you have a shape like maybe like this one, and if I set this grid to a really low value, like 2. Yeah, so let's say I have this shape. This looks cool. Sounds interesting, right? Sounds kind of buzzy, even though it looks like a sine wave. But not really good for your speakers and not good for mixing. So a good idea would be to remove the DC offset, meaning make sure that it's oscillating off that center point equally. Now it still sounds exactly the same, but the end result in terms of mixing, in terms of headroom will be much better. Flip vertical, this is pretty straightforward, but if you look at the waveform, you'll see how it flips it upside down. That's vertically, but we can also flip horizontally, which basically reverses the wavetable. This is an identical shape, so we're not going to see a difference, but let's say I pick this one. And if I flip this horizontally, you can see all those peaks are moved over here, and we flip the whole thing. Next, we have shift horizontal to zero crossing. So remember earlier I was talking about, maybe I can use this to get it to the zero crossing, but we have an option right here. So it'll just make sure that we start exactly at the zero crossing. So it basically shifts the entire waveform and finds the first point in the waveform that's on the zero crossing, which is over here. I just hit undo. And now if I redo, you'll notice that this part will jump all the way over there. Shift horizontal zero crossing. There we go. All right, next, initialize or silence it, right? So this will just basically make it complete silence. Let's undo that. Fade edges, this is very helpful, and it follows the grid size. So if my grid size is 0, and if I choose to fade the edges, it does a really smooth fade, almost like a filtering on the entire shape. But let me undo that and set a larger grid size. So now only this much is going to be faded in the end here, and only this much is going to be faded at the beginning here. Let's try that. Fade edges. Yeah, there we go. So you can see the change there. Helpful. There's also crossfade. So, I mean, honestly, I don't know how much of a difference that makes, but you could see that it did change. So you can try that if you like it. Filter based on grid size. Look at that. So based on the grid size, we basically, remember this shape we use? So it's kind of a similar concept. It's just doing it for you in one go. Sample redux. This is fun. So right now I have this very mellow shape. Like we have nice smooth curves, no sharp edges. So it sounds very sine-like, very organ-like. So now if I select sample redux at grid size, we basically added steps. We're getting all those upper aliased frequencies in the sound, which is kind of cool. Send to noise oscillator. So this is pretty fun. When I select this entire shape, let's close out of here, is inside the noise oscillator. So let's turn that on. Look at that. That's the shape. Sounds a little bizarre, but that's basically the noise oscillator. Let's enable pitch tracking. Yeah, let's try that again. Yeah, so it works a little different because this is kind of like a sample playback engine as opposed to a real wavetable engine. So it could be fun to explore. All right, let's go back in here. So we looked at all the single options. Now, all does this, whatever you select, to the entire group, right? So let's say I want to normalize everything, not just individual ones. I can select that. I want to remove DC offset on all the frames to do that. Flip all of them, vertical or horizontal. Fade the edges, all of them. Filter all of them. Remove fundamental. So this is new. We haven't seen this before. So if I select this, the fundamental frequency will disappear. A good way to understand this is to look at this part here. I haven't explained this yet. We'll come to this very soon. But this is basically the fundamental frequency. And then when I select not under single, it was under all. Remove fundamental, you notice that's completely gone. So we've gotten rid of the fundamental tone. Can be helpful when you want to add a bass, a separate bass sound, get rid of a fundamental or out of your sound by doing that. Let me undo this. Right, you hear the low end. And if I choose remove fundamental, that's gone. All right, I'll undo that. Moving along, what else do we have? Remove low spectra, remove low phases. So maybe I should start talking about this because some of this stuff won't make sense unless we talk about this. So let's do a little segue before we continue through this. Let's talk about this FFT view. So this is the graph editor. So we know how to use this. What is this? And you notice that as I'm making changes here, the changes being updated over here because this update option is on. It's essentially the same thing. It's just a different view or a different way to edit the information. This is a additive synthesis style fast Fourier transform of the shape. So basically what we have here is individual bins. These bins represent individual harmonics. So let's say I'll select this one shape here. And if I click and drag, I'm adjusting a specific harmonic. Let's just wipe out everything. In fact, I can right click here. We have some options, clear all. Everything's cleared out, no sound. I'm just going to bring in one bin. And we get a nice sine wave. If I get rid of that first one, I'm going to play the same note. Let's hear the second bin. It's the same sine wave an octave above. Octave and a fifth above. Octave above that. And so on and so forth. By the way, this is not real time. You notice how when I click and drag and let go, then eventually we hear the result. And it's a little odd, but I believe that's because this update FFT is on. If I turn this off, sorry, no, I was wrong about that. So the interesting thing about the update FFT is, yes, it will update the waveform. Right, so if I have this off or on, yeah, the waveform is always updated. But if I make any changes here to update this, this has to be on. Right, so let me make some drastic changes here. And you can see the very drastic changes happening over here. Now, while update FFT is on, if I was to just draw some of these individual bins, so I'm basically adding in all these harmonics, and I guess towards the tail end removing some of these harmonics. Notice how it kind of went back down. Let me do that again. I want them to be louder and coming down. I notice it kind of brings, it's kind of like normalizing our shape because this update FFT is on. If I turn this off, it'll let me do whatever. We're in 4x zoom. I can reduce this to the entire spectrum. We have 512 individual bins. Right, so you can really go crazy and essentially draw your own shape by adding individual sine waves based on this harmonic series. Right, let's go back to 4. We don't need that many. All right. In fact, let's clear all. So we're starting from scratch. Add a few of these. You can see our sine wave. And then as I add more stuff, the sound gets more and more rich, and we can see the result here as well. Now, what about this bottom section? So that's the individual harmonics or loudness of the individual harmonics, these bars here. This is the phase for each harmonic. So it's easier to understand this just with one. So I have this one sine wave, nice and loud. Now I can adjust the phase of this. Look at that. I've moved it more, moved it more. So that's in percentage, right? So all these individual harmonics or these individual sine waves, they all have phases. And that could end up changing the resulting shape. And of course, the tone as well. So whenever you're making a particular shape, be aware that, oh, I also can just change the phase of that individual or those individual harmonics. All right, so that's the FFT editor. Now let's go back over here and we may be able to understand some of the stuff. Remove low spectra. So basically, we see a spectrum over here. We're removing the lower end. So let's see what that does. Oh, update FFT was off. So let's turn that on. Let me undo it and do it again. So go to all, select remove low spectra. Right, you see how a whole bunch of them just disappeared? And of course, the shape also changed. And of course, it sounds very thin. Let me undo a few of these. All right, so back to normal. And again, keep in mind, this was affecting all. I'm going to do it one more time. In fact, let's do it to the phases. So remove the phase of the low spectra and keep an eye on all the other frames as well. Look at that. They all changed. Yeah, so that's kind of interesting. And really interesting how even though we have the actual volume for the harmonics, but the phase is gone, and that's drastically changed the sound. So phase is very, very important. All right, what else we have? Sample redux at grid size. We've seen this, but again, it'll affect all of them. Resize tables. This is interesting. Resize tables to be half. Now, initially, I was a bit confused about this. So does that mean instead of 9, I'm going to have about 4, 4.5? Let's see what this does. So let's keep an eye on frame number 2. So I'm just going to select all, resize tables to be half, all right? So 2x total number. So now instead of 9 frames, we have 18 frames. And remember that frame number 2, which was a sine wave, has been split into 2. So sometimes you may come up with an interesting wavetable and you realize, you know what, it's a bit too messy. I need to further subdivide it. So this could be a helpful feature. Pretty buzzy and noisy. We're going to talk about how to make this smoother soon. All right, so we were looking at remove low spectral, low phase, sample redux, resize. Resize table to be double. That'll be the opposite. So it'll basically go back to how it was. So don't need to undo. It kind of takes care of that. It's a long list here. This is a funny one. Create pulse width from this table to all. All right, so let's say I want to do pulse width modulation, right? So hopefully you understand what pulse width modulation is. So when I select this, I'm basically saying, this is my shape. Now for all the other frames, we have a full wavetable now, 256 frames. I want you to squish this, kind of like how a pulse width modulation effect happens. So as I go through these frames, look at that. Look how it's bending. Right? It's not a pulse. It's not a pulse, but it is creating that pulse width modulation on the entire shape. So that's pretty cool. All right, what else we have? Nudge all phases for fundamentals to 50%. This is kind of a subtle thing, but I don't have, let me set some options here. All right. So it wasn't accepting this one because we don't have. So if you don't have a harmonic, you obviously can't adjust the phase for it, right? All right, so keep an eye on the spectrum over here, or specifically the phase. And I'll select nudge all phases for fundamental to 50%. So that just got completely removed. All right, so yeah, kind of a strange option there, but it is what it is. Where will we nudge all? So set spectra, this frame to all. Now these ones are kind of obscure and strange, but also do some interesting things. So let me actually undo this back to our initial one that we had, undo a few more times. I made quite a few changes. Yeah, so let's say we have these shapes over here. Now let's select under all. This is interesting. So set spectra, this frame to all. So I've selected frame number 9. So keep an eye on keep an eye on the sine wave. Let's see what happens to that. So set spectra, this frame to all. So you notice that they all look similar, but not exactly the same. So I think what's happening is that, some additive synthesis stuff is happening over here. It's getting some information from the spectrum of this wavetable, this frame, and applying it to the other one, so they all kind of start to look like it. But yet it's subtly different. So it's kind of an interesting feature there. So similarly, we have set phases. So one was for spectra, the other one is for phases. Now this is interesting. Set spectra from other oscillators. So I can be like, let's undo this again. I can be like, hey, you get information from the other ones. So, okay, how does that work? So now this looks a bit different. It's kind of interesting. It's like a filter being applied. And that sine wave got louder, or it's pretty much the same. This one's a bit quieter and has like weird bumps across it. So really interesting options over here. set spectra from other oscillators, set phases from other oscillators. So wow, this kind of simplified it into like some of those basic geometrical shapes. Very interesting. Then what else do we have? Subtract spectra from other oscillators. Let me undo this because now it's too simple. So let's say, okay, a sine wave has nothing, right? Aside from the fundamental. What happens if we subtract from other oscillators? it's completely gone. All right, so not a good example. But if I pick something more harmonically rich, all set subtract spectra from other oscillators. Great, so it's doing the same thing. I don't know. Let's try this one. Subtract spectra from other oscillators. What if I select a bunch of them? All subtract spectra from other oscillators. Yeah, I don't know. So I don't quite understand that very well, but yeah, you may want to experiment with the subtract spectra from other oscillators. Blur. Oh, so this is nice. Blur spectra. So let's undo this. So I have this shape. Let's actually add some sharp edges. All right, so that's our shape. And now I'm going to select blur spectra adjacent bins. So what are bins? By the way, these bars, they're called bins. So let's try that. Adjacent bins with the grid size. Okay. So essentially it tries to smoothen things out. And you can see our spectrum for the harmonics is kind of like pretty much even. Oh, it does gradually get softer, but it's fairly even. Let me undo that before we move on. So really interesting stuff in here. Blur phases. So instead of just a spectra, let's try the phases. Now the phases are kind of all over the place. If I select this, it's different, but it didn't like create a straight line. And that has changed the sound significantly. So that's interesting. So we have blur spectra, adjacent bins, blur phases, adjacent bins, blur spectra, adjacent frames. All right, so not from adjacent bins, but adjacent frames. So I've selected number 8, and let's see what happens when I choose adjacent frames. Ah, that's interesting. So this could be a useful way to kind of smoothen out. So let's try this. It's still kind of steppy, but it sounds like it's smoother. There's still another way to smoothen things with this morph option, but this can also give us a similar effect. And then we have the same option for phase. Wow, phase, look at that. How dramatic phase changes the sound. And it's a lot smoother now. All right, I keep clicking on morph. Last one, shift horizontal to zero crossing. So we saw that, right? So this affects all the wavetables. Sorry, I keep calling it wavetable, all the individual frames. All right, a lot of stuff in here. So, and you can see it's a little different from the single ones because you can do a lot more things to a group of frames as opposed to single ones. Maybe now we can finally talk about morphing. So let me undo and go back to that harsher set we had. Maybe further. Can I do more? Yeah, maybe something like this. All right, I have 9 frames. They're all kind of very steppy sounding. I want to smoothen them out. I can click on morph here. We have 4 different ways to morph, and they all lead to different results. The simplest one is crossfade, where it basically crossfades from one waveform to another and creates, additional frames. We don't see them, but we will hear them. Right? Well, I guess you can see them, but they're not like listed over here. Right, so no longer steppy. It's very smooth. Let me undo that. Did it do it? Oh, there we go. 1 to 9. How about spectral? Now this, I like this because what's happening here now is it's not just a normal crossfade. It's actually looking at all the harmonics, looking at the phase, and it is then crossfading, individual harmonics at like an additive. Basically in a more fancy way, right? So it's not just a normal crossfade like in your DAW. So when I choose spectral, now it's not about one being better than the other. It's just, different options. You may like one over the other. It also depends on the actual wavetable itself. So you can experiment with those two. And then we have these two, more spectral 0 fundamental phase, more spectral 0 all phases. So when I choose 0 fundamental phase, this is our fundamental. Weirdly, it's already zeroed out. Let me just add one here. Right, so for that one. Interesting. Many of those did not have fundamental phase. Oh, well, the phase doesn't have to be all the way up. It can be anywhere, but I just wanted to set it to a random value. All right, so we have all these different frames. Now I'm going to choose morph, and it's going to now zero the fundamental phase. All right, so now it basically set to 0 for all of them. Yeah, and that might be helpful to start from there, right? The fundamental phase being 0, maybe it'll help with like the zero crossing issues and stuff like that that could happen. 0 all phases. So this is interesting. So now if we look across all the different wavetables, we don't have any phase information. It's all at 0. Yeah, so these all lead to different ways of morphing. So you have to try which one works best for any given situation. And then there's remove morph tables, and we're back to our original. Next, let's check out the formula parser. All right, so what we have here is a mathematical way of creating a particular shape or an entire wavetable. Now, honestly, I do not know how to do that, so I do not know how these formulas work, but I can talk about it. So if I click over here, you don't have to generate formulas or learn how to create these formulas yourself. You can just select from one of these. So let's say I want a organ-ish shape. So I'll select that. So this fancy formula leads to this specific shape, right? So that was just that single one. So I selected this particular frame and I've created this shape. Let's try a different one. Let's try square triangle. No, that's one of the shapes we get in the default ones. That's nice. Now we also have processing options. So you can generate frames with this, but towards the end you can see PROC, process. So we can squarify. Well, this is already kind of square. Let's first create that organish thing, and then let's try to squarify this one. Squarify, and look at that, kind of squarifies it, I guess. I guess maybe let's pick something more complex like this and go over here and now squarify this. Look at that. It's trying to squarify it. It's basically getting rid of all even harmonics. You only have odd harmonics. There's a squarify alt. Let's try that as well. So I'm going to double squarify it. Yeah, that just kind of got rid of it. Let me undo twice. And now let's squarify alt this time. Yeah, so very similar, but that's basically formulas. Now that was for an individual frame. You can also do it for the entire wavetable. They call it multis, and this is a pretty significant list. And these also have process options. But let's create one. Let's try talkative 1. Look at that. So 256 frames have been generated. Let's listen to it from the beginning. It has a formant-like tonality to it. And let's process all of these wavetables. There's the squarify option, but let's try octaves only. Do we have other options? Not too many processing options. Let's try octave. There aren't many harmonics to begin with. Let's try the squarify alt. All right. Okay, interesting. So I guess mileage will vary depending on what you're working with. Formula parser, right? So this is how you could create things from scratch. Now, here's something fun to do. ChatGPT knows how this works, and ChatGPT is really good with math and formulas. So I asked ChatGPT, like, hey, give me a shape that's kind of like a 808 type sound. So I'm going to copy this and paste it. Let's clear this out. How do we clear stuff? Go to remove init all. So it's all cleared out. And I'll paste that formula. Right, so you have to hit enter, and then that shape gets accepted. Kind of looks like an 808. I don't know, maybe. Let's try the other one. There's cleaner version with longer decay. Copy that. Paste that in. Hit enter. So it's just a little bit more filtered. So yeah, you could use some kind of AI tool to generate formulas and use that instead of the options we have here, or instead of learning your own formulas. And any formula that you find interesting, you can also save as your formulas that you can recall for later on. All right, let's now talk about importing audio into the Wavetable editor. In fact, before we talk about importing audio, let's talk about extracting information from an image and using that to create a wavetable. So it's pretty cool that you can actually do that. So I have some pictures that I've kind of pre-selected here. all just AI generated images. This is a good example. So we're seeing one image and we're seeing a inverted version of that. So let's work with this. I'll drag this image. Now images have to be PNG files. So just drag the PNG file on the Wavetable editor here. And now it's created a shape. Now you might be thinking, how does this actually work? If I click over here and we look at the 3D version of this wavetable, now it's starting to make sense. You can kind of see the shape of the lady. So the brighter parts tend to be more towards the positive in terms of the amplitude, and then the darker parts will go down. So let's run through this one more time. Yeah, so with images, you get some really harsh, bright harmonics. Let's compare it with the inverted version. So now you can see all the dark parts are much lower, and then just the lady, it's a bit hard to see the actual shape of her, but this part here is brighter, so it's louder, or it's on the more positive end as opposed to the negative end. So anyway, this could be a fun way to create new wavetables, especially harsh, bright, like really, really rich wavetables. All right, let's talk about importing actual audio. Now I have this vocal here. Let's have a quick listen to it. So let's bring this in. I'm going to initialize this, initialize all. So you can drag and drop. You can drag and drop here as well. You can drag and drop in that front panel over here, but also in this editor view. So I'll drag and drop here, and you have all these different ways to import audio, and they all lead to different results of how Serum is going to take this audio file and convert it into a wavetable. Let's talk about the first one, import normal dynamic pitch zero snap. You notice that the two of them that have dynamic pitch, right? This one says dynamic pitch, and this one says dynamic pitch. So the vocal that I'm using here is dynamic in terms of pitch. It's not the same pitch. So maybe one of these two would work well. Let's try this one. It says zero snapping. So it snaps to zero crossing. Let's select that. And now we've created a wavetable. Let's scrub through it. In fact, just to make this easy, I'm going to add an LFO to this so I don't have to keep doing this again and again. Drag an LFO to wavetable position and just let it, let's go slow. Let's listen to the original vocal again. There's a lot of pitch variation, but what Serum has done is it basically creates a pitch map and says, okay, here the pitches are changing. Let's all set it to this one particular pitch. So, you know, when you play a specific note, we're just hearing that note. Pretty cool, right? So it's not sounding exactly like the original audio sample, but it's creating this really interesting effect. All right, let's try the other one. Import normal dynamic pitch follow. So this had zero snapping, this one did not, or does not. So now let's compare. So as you can hear, there's a lot of clicks and pops because it's not trying to find the zero crossing. It's like, I don't care, I'm just going to look out for the pitch information and just make sure it's all the same note, but I'm not bothering about the zero crossing. So we're getting a lot of clicks and pops. All right, what about the third option here? Import constant frame size, pitch average. So now it's like, you know what? I'm assuming this entire audio is the same pitch. And you can also see over here, split at 143 samples. So it's just basically taking the audio, chopping it up into 143 samples chunks, right? And creating like 256 frames out of it. And it's saying like that's going to be the average note. But of course, if I'm playing a C, we will hear a C. Though as you can see, it's not doing a good job because the pitch does change, right? You can see how it's scrolling. When it's scrolling side to side, that means you know that the pitch is not the same. It's an interesting effect, but I don't know, in certain scenarios, you may not want that, right? So if you have a lot of dynamic pitch changes, do not select the other one. Now, you notice that every time I drag this, I'm seeing this option because we have this in the formula parser. So let's get rid of that, clear that out. Now I'll drag it in again, and I have the other options. All right, so we saw all these three options. Now this is new, import frequency estimation. So now it's kind of similar to this, just kind of estimating what the overall pitch is. So it scans through the entire audio and it says like, all right, so this is what the approximate pitch is going to be. And then these are all the harmonics that are being added on top of that. So let's hear this. Really interesting to see the variety in phase, but very little information in terms of the actual loudness of the harmonic. Well, that was just that one frame, right? Because that's super quiet. Maybe this one you'll see a lot more. Now this is better, right? Because it actually scanned through the entire thing and try to estimate what the pitch is as opposed to just averaging and picking one number. All right, so we've looked at these options. Let's now take a look at the FFT options. Now this is quite different from the other options here. In all these four options, Serum is taking the audio, trying to analyze it, chop it back, and then place it into the wavetable editor or in the wavetable. Here, Serum is looking at the audio, and then it is recreating the sound, basically like this FFT mode here, recreating the sound based on the frame size. So let's start with the smallest. FFT analysis of 256 frames. So it chops the audio up into 256 frames, analyzes it, recreates it, transfers it into the frequency domain, and then recreates the entire sound. All right, sounds very different. Let me go a bit lower. Very garbly. It could be because of the frame size. Let's go for a slightly larger frame size. How about 512 samples? Yeah, still fairly grungy. May not be ideal for vocal samples, but let's go even further, 1024. You can see how each frame looks a lot more complex because, you know, there's a larger chunk being analyzed. And also I notice I have to go lower to get the pitch because as I increase that size, the frequency also seems to be going up higher. So I'm down here. That sounds pretty decent. It does have that chipmunk effect. Lastly, let's try 2048. I need to go even lower. In fact, let me just transpose the octave down here a couple of octaves. It's a cool effect. We're getting those, you know, gaps in the sound. Interesting. Now I only have 51 frames. I guess we could morph. Let's do a spectral morph. It's nice. Still have that tremolo effect. Yeah, so that's the way to import audio, all the different ways to import audio, right? So every one of these options will give you a different result. So think about what you're importing. Is there pitch information? Is the pitch information consistent? Maybe one of these would work well. If there's a lot of pitch changes, maybe this one with the zero sampling would work better. If you want to experiment, maybe it's not voice, it's something else, you can try one of the FFT options as well. Now, one last thing I want to talk about is saving your wavetables. Now, you can export wavetables, but generally you're just going to save your preset, right? But if you're using any kind of audio import, that also needs to be saved separately. If you were to just save the preset without saving the original audio file that you're referencing, it'll work fine as long as you're on the same computer and it'll keep referencing wherever that original vocal is saved. But if you were to send the preset to someone else, or if you were to delete that original sample or move it around, you'll get an error. So makes sense to embed the sample into the preset by clicking over here. So once you select that, now this sample is going to be saved with the preset itself. So that's one thing to keep in mind whenever you're dragging in any audio. Now, I don't think this applies to images. So if I was to drag in a different image and drop it in over here, Let's turn this off and turn this on. I guess it does have that option here to embed the wavetable into the preset when saving. So yeah, I guess it's referencing that image all the time. So make sure to select that. But if you're working with regular wavetables, you don't have to worry about that. You won't have that option, right? And this also works for if you're making some edits. So I go in here and I make some changes. And let's say I do the morph. Well, there's only one. So yeah, it says you can't morph one table. But let's say I have a second one, make some changes here, and I morph to have 256. And now close out of here. There's no such option. I can save this wavetable. I can click the save button and save this as a wave file or as a wavetable and reopen that. But if I save the preset, this will be there. But only samples and I guess images need to be embedded. All right, so that is it for this video, and that covers everything you need to know about the Wavetable editor and importing audio/images into the Wavetable editor.